Tonight, the first of 5 debates we're planning on the fiscal treaty, on which there will be a referendum on the 31st of May. Joining us tonight are Dan OBrien, economics editor of the Irish Times, who's largely in favour of the fiscal treaty, and Declan Ganley, the well-known businessman, who's largely opposed to the fiscal treaty. Later we'll be joined by businesswoman Lana Lynch for our preview of tomorrow morning's newspapers. If you'd like to comment on the programme, you can text us to 53131 and place the word tonight before a comment, or send us a tweet at #FinB or email us at tonight@tv3.ie. I've done a blog on tonight's programme on the website politico.ie, and I hope to respond after the programme again on the website politico.ie to some of the issues raised in the texts and tweets. Before we get into tonight's programme, I want to say how sad the death this morning of Barney McKenna has been, one of the founder members of the Dubliners, as you've heard in the news. The departure of the last of the founder members is an end of an era for people of my generation who grew up with the Dubliners, and I was fortunate to know some of them. I also want to express my sadness at the death of Louis Kilcoyne, a former president of the FAI and member of the Irish Olympic Council. I got to know Louis through his brother-in-law John Giles. I found him a lovely man with a gentle sense of humour. All right, let's get into tonight's programme. And Dan, what do you think are the persuasive reasons for voting yes to the fiscal treaty in the referendum?
The most important one is because of the gravity of the whole crisis. The reason that we have this treaty is because the euro, the edifice, the euro edifice simply has not functioned, and it is at risk of collapsing. And that would be a disastrous, truly disastrous thing for this country, for Europe, and indeed the rest of the world. And this is one part, and only a small part, of rebuilding the edifice and making it stronger so that it does survive. So that, head and shoulders, is the most important reason to support this thing.
Just to tease out that a little bit, even if our vote against the fiscal treaty were to cause the fiscal treaty itself to be cancelled, how would that lead to a collapse of the Eurozone, or the collapse of the euro?
As I say, this is one part of a broader strategy to try and redesign the whole thing. Not nearly enough has been done. This crisis has dragged on for 2 years. Leaders, and I think it's become almost a cliche, that European leaders did too little too late all throughout the crisis. They have acted with this. If even this small measure can't be agreed and implemented, then I think it will send a further signal that really Europe doesn't have the political will or the political capability to redesign its failed institution, and that itself will send a very powerful signal and could, there's huge uncertainty about everything now, but it could become self-fulfilling and make the crisis worse.
A lot of people say that the fiscal treaty is quite unnecessary and does very little. It changes very little. Now, it does change the requirement to reduce the budget deficit to 0.5% rather than 3%, but otherwise it changes very little. All the disciplines that that's in the fiscal treaty are already present. They add to two previous sets of new rules, so it's more rules. And I think, yes, there is a need in Europe. The Greek situation was a fiscal crisis, the Italian situation a fiscal crisis, the Portuguese situation a fiscal crisis. None of those countries had banking crises. They were all fiscal crises, and they didn't manage their public finances well, and that was very clear. And now we need stronger rules, more effectively implemented, to make sure countries don't stay in high debt situations for a long time. Just to press that issue a little further, that if we had those rules in operation prior to our fiscal crisis, it wouldn't have caused us to avoid the fiscal crisis.
That's debatable. The structural this idea of a structural deficit, which looks more deeply, it doesn't just look at revenues and expenditure, it looks more deeply at the nature of revenues. And are those revenues sustainable? Or in our case, as we know, they were a huge chunk of government revenues were being generated by a building boom. Now, even if that boom had just plateaued and we didn't have the crash, we would have had a big slowdown in government revenues. And there was a huge failure in the economics community as well as the policymaking community to flag that risk. Now, if we had had that structural balance measure, we would have been looking more closely at that, and there is a possibility that it, at the very least, would have lessened the crisis that we have in this country.
The idea of the structural deficit seems, the definition of structural deficit seems to be fairly arbitrary, and that you could tweak it around to mean one thing in one situation, another thing in another situation, so it's not there. But finally, can I ask you, why would it be so awful for Europe if we were to vote against? Because it's going to go ahead anyway. Unlike we can't, like with European treaties, if we vote against, that's it can't happen. But in this instance, it's not a European treaty, not an EU treaty. If we vote against, it happens anyway.
So what would that mean? It would mean that on the basis that the 16 other members of the Eurozone ratify it, that you have a Eurozone bound by rules, but there's one exception. Ireland isn't bound by those rules. Now, I think that would not be a good thing. Rules, everybody has to abide by the same rules.
But the rules exist anyway.
But not these new specific. There are two specific new rules, two metrics, and I think it's very important to look back last year. A much bigger set of rules were agreed last year that most people didn't notice, but they included dozens of new metrics. The problem with the crisis that we had, and it differs in every country. The Greek crisis is different from the Italian crisis and the Spanish crisis. The problem is that we just weren't alive enough to the economic fragilities and risks that are there. We need to look at economies from a whole different perspectives with different metrics to see where the weaknesses are. And that's what's happened, and this is one small part of doing that.
All right, you've left out another argument which to many people seems to be the Trump argument. To them it seems to be the Trump argument, and it is that if we don't sign up to the fiscal treaty, we could be, or very likely would be, excluded from a second bailout under the new ESM mechanism. Should we need a second bailout, and there's a grave danger we will need a second bailout?
I think there's, again, I go back to saying that we are in an extremely uncertain situation. In my view, that it could go to two extremes. It could be that if we vote no to this, and we do need a second bailout, that a way will be found to give us a second bailout without to prevent us defaulting, because we saw with Greece, when a country defaults or there's a risk of default, the contagion effect it has on everyone is massive. Alternatively, it could go to the other extreme, and a year down the road, if the crisis is still going on and people are increasingly saying, look, this situation is not sustainable, we need to shrink the Eurozone down to make it sustainable and cut out the problematic bits, that some people might say Greece is economically and politically problematic, Ireland is politically problematic, it won't join up to the rules, it votes against every change that we have. Some people may say, if we're going to shrink this thing down and we're going to do surgery, rather than cutting one part out, let's cut all the difficult parts out and bring it down to a sustainable
level. Can't be done.
Look, you say that legally, and that's correct. But in any crisis that's sufficiently grave, ways will be
people
found
don't bother
around.
With the
legality, people will find ways. Like there was a no bailout clause. The euro was founded on a no bailout clause. When Greece needed a bailout, that very quickly happened. So, if you have a crisis that's sufficiently serious, and this crisis could hardly be more serious,
all right,
ways will be found to do things.
Declan, the arguments against approving the fiscal treaty.
The main argument is that the fiscal treaty, as set, will not solve our problem, and it will not solve Europe's problem. It's a Teutonic tonic designed to placate the readers of German tabloids rather than address the real chronic financial problems that the whole of the European Union is suffering from, namely the chronic insolvency that exists across the financial system. This is something that has been done to placate German voters because their political elites have not communicated to them the facts, for example, that in Ireland we have assisted in the bailout of their financial institutions with the bank portion of the debt. And I would say, Vincent, that I would give a qualified no to this at the moment, insofar as that no on this occasion means maybe. We need a deal on the bank debt. It has to happen. Our government has failed to deliver it for whatever reason, maybe for good reasons, but they have not been able to deliver it. This is an opportunity to focus the debate. It's not going to solve the problem anyway. So if this was going to solve Europe's problem, it would be utterly irresponsible to say that, of course, I would be calling for a yes vote. But it doesn't. It doesn't solve Europe's problem. It doesn't solve our problem. We know that to solve our problem we have to uncouple this bank debt. We know we have to purge the insolvency out of the whole European financial system, and we need to put in place the democratic control mechanisms to ensure that as we continue to transfer more sovereignty to the centre in Europe, that those exercising it over us have accountability to it at a ballot box. Nothing is being done to address the democratic deficit. There's not enough time between now and the 31st of May for that to happen, but there is enough time to get a deal done on the bank debt. If we get a deal done on the bank debt, I think we should view this treaty very differently.
Dan?
I absolutely agree that we need relief on the bank debt. I think that will come. I think the question is how big it'll be. Will it be little more than symbolic, or will it be reasonably significant? And I think that is very much in play at the moment. But I think we need to decouple the issue of the bank debt thing and think, is this thing in our interests overall? And is it in our interests to vote it down? Now, I'm not saying for a minute that this will solve Europe's problems, but it does two big things. It looks at that fiscal problem, and we clearly have a major fiscal problem. Governments have got too in debt over these decades, and with more rules, better designed rules, we bring that down.
Sorry to interrupt you, because maybe we just explain what the fiscal problem is. The fiscal problem is that governments throughout Europe, or several governments throughout Europe, in several states in Europe, have spent more money than they get in taxes, and it has been that has led to serious debt problems. That's the fiscal issue.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry, yeah. So governments, in other words, borrowing year after year so that their debt is much bigger than their entire economic output, and we suddenly find that, look, a country like Italy that had a huge debt for 30 years was able to sustain it for 30 years, and now suddenly things have changed, and now people are much less willing to allow a government to lend to a government because they fear not getting their money back. So we've got that economic problem. But there's also the issue, you mentioned this thing about Germany. And speaking about German voters being placated, I think, voters in this country need to be reassured. You could call that placated, reassured, but I think voters
the way
in this
to reassure us is do a deal on the bank debt.
Well, I think
I'll be reassured.
I think we know that it's on the agenda. Now, it wouldn't be on the agenda if something wasn't going to happen. Now, the question is how big something is going to be. We don't know that yet. I sincerely hope it's going to be big. We all do.
Well,
Anybody who pays tax in this country
we have a
wants
way
it
of focusing the debate, and that is a date, which is May the 31st.
But what's wrong with placating the German electorate? If it means that by placating the German electorate, the German government is facilitated to help the general bailout of Europe from the financial crisis? Because
the formula that Germany is pursuing right now isn't going to solve Europe's problem. That's really what this is all about. Now, I like some of the things I've heard coming from Angela Merkel, from her foreign minister, Guido Westerwelle, from the Polish foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, in terms of a new constitutional arrangement in Europe. We urgently need that. We shouldn't be wasting time on this nonsense treaty.
We need a constitutional arrangement in Europe.
Yes, we do. Yeah, this is the argument I made through Lisbon. Europe and its structures are not accountable to its citizens. I'm a federalist. I've supported the idea of a United States of Europe. I believe it's possible. I think we should dare to have that sort of ambition. But before we can get there, before we can create a federal structures in Europe with real accountability that protect the interests of the small member states, we need to solve this issue of chronic insolvency. This treaty doesn't do it. This formula doesn't do it. Germany's approach at the moment is not doing it. We need euro bonds. We need the insolvency purge before those are issued, and they have to be secured by the tax revenues of at least the Eurozone member states, and preferably the whole of the European Union. That doesn't mean we can't have tax competition, but that's the only...
Okay, but
until we get to that place, Vincent, there will be no recovery in Europe.
How do you deal with the argument that we run the risk of being denied a bailout again if we need a bailout?
I agree with Dan. I think it'll happen anyway.
No, Dan didn't say that. He said that's one scenario. The other scenario could be that it wouldn't happen.
I'm not going to come onto your programme and pretend that this strategy is not without risk, because it has risk attached to it. But I can say one thing with absolute certainty, and that is that this treaty, as formulated, will not solve our problem, nor will it solve the European Union's problem.
Maybe.
So it's worth taking some risk.
But isn't it, if you're right about that, it won't solve the European problem, won't solve our problem. But it will, but by voting for it, we'll avoid the risk of being denied a bailout should we need it, and it looks as though we will need it.
Well, we've talked about this before. I mean, our government says we're not going to need it. I suspect we may need it. Yeah. And I suspect that a way will be found to deal with this. However, another thing that has to be factored in is a lot's going to happen between now and then. Spain's going over the cliff this week. Spain may be in a Greek-type scenario before we even have this referendum, or certainly shortly thereafter. The reforms, I think there's an opportunity for us, someone's got to do it, to really stimulate the debate, catalyse the debate for the reforms that will save the European project. If the euro fails, the coin of the realm fails, I think the European project will spin apart.
Declan, you haven't dealt with the issue of the risk, and for most people, I suspect, watching this programme...
But you want to tell me that there's... I cannot tell you that there's no risk.
Well, isn't that then... your argument collapses then,
No, it doesn't. It doesn't, Vincent, because the presumption is that there's a risk-free path. We can pretend that this treaty is going to solve our problem and Europe's problem, and you can say there's no risk. That's false. There's massive risk there. The massive risk is not dealing with the core problems at the heart of the European Union and at the heart of the Irish economy, which is this bank debt issue. The risk of saying no, at least at the first outing to this particular treaty, I think is a far lower risk than the one that the counter-argument suggests that we take, which is that we proceed on full steam ahead, ram the iceberg, then it's not going to work.
Dan.
What I don't understand is if I see no risk of voting in favour of this thing. I see risks of voting against it, but I don't see any risk to this country of voting in favour of it.
Do you think that, I mean, okay, I believe, if you look at the evidence, that that European leadership is being extremely reckless in terms of not addressing the core issues of insolvency, competition, all of the things that the open market, that the European Union was founded on. All those principles have been thrown out the window. And I think every day that we allow that to go unaddressed, that the risks of the Eurozone collapsing in an uncontrolled way and the resultant fallout being the releasing of centrifugal forces that could collapse the European Union, I believe those risks are escalated. I believe they're being compounded every day. I think that pretending that this treaty is going to solve those problems...
But I don't think anybody's saying that. That's the point.
Well, then why are we doing this?
Because it's one part of a multi-part solution.
To placate the German electorate.
Exactly.
Isn't that enough? That's enough.
So this is... No, it's not.
We're doing it because to placate the German electorate and to give ourselves insurance that should things go wrong again, we will have access to a bailout rescue.
And who's to say that that's going to be there? I mean, this all presumes... I had a debate earlier on this evening. People say, well, someone's going to come along and pay our nurses and our guards and fill our ATMs. The whole Eurozone is at risk. It is making a huge mistake of not purging this insolvency. It has to be done. Now, to be selfish, and we're the ones that are voting on this on May the 31st, we have this gargantuan issue, and goodness knows you have talked about it for long enough here, of this bank debt. Our government seems to have been singularly incapable of getting it off our shoulders. Then it comes over to us. It's time for us to take a stand and say, you need to listen to the concerns of the Irish people. This bank debt issue is unjust, it's immoral, it makes no economic sense, it needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with before the 31st of May.
Well, I certainly agree that it does need to be dealt with, and I think there's every reason, morally, for any sense of justice, that because part of that debt was taken on to protect the wider European financial system, that the rest of Europe should contribute and not have that heaped on us. Now, we have to take most of the blame for it, but I think there is a case because it was for the rest of the system to share it. But I can't see how a small country in a weakened position is going to put a gun to everyone's head and say, give us what we want, or we're going to make things difficult, even for ourselves. It doesn't make any sense in our own interests.
You use the tools you have. And the thing is, we have this referendum, and no one's listening to us. You heard Draghi yesterday. You have to pay it all. I mean, and I have a lot of respect for Mario Draghi and some of the things that he says. You've read the headlines from Der Spiegel. You know, the Irish have accepted their fate. We are being taken for granted. They assume we are docile, servile, and that we are going to carry this weight, which isn't ours.
But again, this comes back to how strong a position you take with people.
But this is more than a technical argument, Dan.
But I'm not saying but it's about diplomacy. It's about saying how much power do we have to influence a situation where people are more powerful than us? How hard do you want to push it? How much strength do you have? How much leverage do you have? Now, how much leverage do you think this country seriously has?
On this issue, I think we have leverage. I think we have to play hardball here.
But because we have to play hardball doesn't mean we have leverage.
Yeah,
these are two different things.
But we do have leverage because because first of all, they want this thing. We've got something that they want. We're not ratifying the ESM treaty until such time as this issue is resolved. I'm very glad that the government has taken that very sensible path. And to take it the next step further, let's say there was a no vote. Would they get the ESM treaty ratified and the unanimity that's required to put that through? That's open to debate. Now, we have every reason to believe that, given previous form, that if our concerns are not listened to, I think that this government has a real chance of losing this. This isn't for somebody to win, but there's a chance that they will lose this, and that they will lose this because the people that they're negotiating with in Europe do not listen to them and do not give them the deal that they've been looking for on this bank debt. They need to give it to them. They need to listen to our government representatives. What they're saying is correct, and nobody in Europe should be presuming, which they are right now, that there is going to be a yes vote to this issue, because there may not be.
Just coming back, that old pearl of ancestral wisdom on Tainach will Lord and Ifalor the Veglick, he who isn't strong has to be smart. You know, we're not strong, so we've got to play this smart. We can't go rampaging around, warning, telling everybody this is how you do it, kick the door down in Frankfurt, tell people it's Frankfurt's way. It just doesn't. The world doesn't work that way. You know, when you're one country out of 17, you've got a population of 5 million out of 500 million people in the EU. You know, you just can't go around demanding, this is what we want.
There is something different, though.
You need to have leverage.
There is something different about us in this context, and this is the only state in the 27-member European Union that the people have any input into what is happening. And Europe has often been accused of being the creature of elites. And whatever you might have said about that up to the last several years, certainly almost everything that's been done in the last several years has been done by elites, with little regard to what the peoples in the European countries want. Now, for the first time, there is a vote, there is a referendum in one of the European countries on an issue that is fairly significant, or of some significance, in the whole edifice that they have recently constructed. And if we, albeit a tiny country in the overall European context, if we vote no, it is a signal that Europe of the elite is out of kilter with the views of the. Okay,
well, like personally, my view is that we should have referendums to things like divorce, those sort of things. You know, for this 10-page, highly technical document, I think it's just crazy to have a whole referendum process on a very technical issue. And you say it's an elite thing, and yeah, I think there's an element of truth in that. But as has often been said, if the original EU back in the 1950s had been put to referendums, the EU would never have existed.
Is that a good or a bad thing?
Well, personally, I think it would be a bad thing, because I think the EU has generally been a good thing.
That it went ahead even though the majority of people in Europe would have opposed it. Is that a good thing?
At least one. Well, the thinking is that at least one of the original 6, that if you put it to a vote in the original 6, one of the countries would have said no, and if one had said no, then it wouldn't have happened as it happened at the time. Take another example, Switzerland. I used to live in Switzerland. They vote all the time. They only gave women the vote in the 1970s. They joined the UN only 10 years ago because people were very conservative about joining international organisations and doing different things.
Yeah, that was because they experienced during wars.
Well, I'm not. It goes back, anyway, back even further. But look, the point. My point is that generally, when it comes to international relations and sort of these sort of treaties, we have a parliament, we elect a government, go out and do these things.
And people shouldn't have any direct say on hugely important issues, such as, for instance, the bank.
Too obscure rules.
Let me finish my question. That are you saying that people shouldn't have that you believe people shouldn't have, for instance, an input into the decision to give this bank guarantee, which will have huge consequences for future generations?
But that's nothing to do with this.
I know, but wait a minute. You seem to be suggesting that because we have a system of representative democracies, people should just stand back and let the political class get on with it. And I'm suggesting, well, there are certain areas where people, even though not constitutionally required, people you might well argue that people should have a say. And I'm instancing one of those circumstances as being the decision to bail out the banks. That's one. Another decision that might have gone to the people was whether to involve the EU and IMF under the terms that they wanted to be involved here, whether that should be approved by the people or not, a significant surrender of sovereignty. Now, a lot of people would think that people should have been involved in that process, and so the representative democracy has certain limitations in excluding people from the big decisions.
But there's a lot of other ways people can participate in the political process. People can protest, people can get in touch with their elected representatives. There's a lot of ways people are involved in the political process other than the idea that you have a full-scale referendum on 10-page technical documents about what a structural budget deficit is. We could sit here for an hour and disagree on how a structural budget deficit is measured. Dan, you
have a point. There's a certain something that's unfortunate that we're sitting here debating, having to debate something that actually does nothing for us that we weren't already doing anyway. But that is designed to placate the readers of Bild in Germany, the German tabloid. In terms of the point you were making, Vincent, vis-à-vis markets, the editors of Bloomberg, your colleagues in the financial side of the media, last week came out with an editorial saying that Ireland should vote no, precisely because this isn't going to solve Europe's problem. We need to send a message, not just to these, to our friends in Europe who are getting it wrong right now, but also to our own political elites who have not addressed the problems of putting Ireland on the correct course and on a solid platform for economic recovery. And I'll bring all of this back again to the issue of fixing the European Union before it's too late. As I say, Spain's about to go into, it looks like, into some real problems, and that will spread contagion. We need to get to the grips of the real reform that's needed in Europe that Angela Merkel and Sarkozy have ignored, which is making the thing solvent, making the thing democratically accountable, and putting in the reforms that will bring that about. This treaty does none of those things.
Okay, let's go to tomorrow morning's newspapers. We're joined by the businesswoman Dana Lynch for our preview of tomorrow morning's newspapers. Let's go straight to the front pages, and we start with the front page of the Irish Times, which leads with Irish households suffer most severe wealth cuts in Europe. This is a story by Dan OBrien, who was with us. Story shows falls from third to seventh richest in 3 years. This story is based on a survey done in the recent edition of the Central Bank Bulletin. Over on the right, Dublin man accused of teenager's murder, and down at the end, I don't know if you can't see it there, we'll get to it in a moment. In the Irish Examiner, Kenny backs Hogan over TD meeting, tensions high in coalition amid fallout over discussions with Lowry. Over on the right, Liberal priest under Vatican investigation. The founder of the Association of Priests, Father Tony Flanagan, is being investigated by the Vatican because of his liberal views. In the Irish Sun, Westlife exclusive Shane, I'll try to pay my debts. Fillon seeks UK court order over millions. Also their Rostas murder charge. Those are the front pages of tomorrow morning's newspapers. Glenna, you've had an opportunity to read some of these.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the story that's not going away is the Michael Lowry, Moriarty and relationships, and the Fine Gael relationships around all of that. All of the papers almost seem to cover it. Certainly in the Daily Mail, Paul Drury joins all the dots really in relation to, he positions Phil Hogan in quite a closing relationship with Michael Lowry, which I don't think there's any denying. I think that would be a matter of record. The other thing that you see is he starts to join the dots for people in terms of how important Michael Lowry would have been over the period of the fundraising drive that finally gave Enda Kenny the ability to deliver a successful election. I think probably then on the editorial of that paper, they're starting to look at something which I think we're going to see an awful lot more of, which is possibly the thought that Enda's sort of hands-off, laissez-faire type management or running of everything just seems to be coming home to roost, and possibly is just not working in the environment that we're in. One of the papers alludes to how he has addressed the situation with Phil Hogan, and apparently telephoned him yesterday and had a conversation, and satisfied himself that actually nothing untoward had happened at that meeting, which just goes to show that he just doesn't get what was wrong with it. And I think a lot of people reading these papers are going to think that just was a very bad call. Not quite seeing the gravity of it at all, and not joining the dots in terms of the fact that they haven't addressed Moriarty. It's still there. They're coming into a referendum stage. They're going to go to referendum and go to the country with a lot of problems. I mean, they have the household issue. They have their general management of lots of things that they've tried to deliver that just don't seem to have happened. And he does seem to have evolved this sort of style of walking and talking, hand pumping. He's out and about. It's very nice optically, but I just wonder who is running things. And I think that's going to be asked. There seems to be an awful lot of loose cannons out there, and I think for a government that's trying to deliver a yes vote, that's going to be very problematic.
But will this issue survive beyond next week, would you think?
The Moriarty?
Yeah.
It should. I think absolutely it should. I think questions need to be asked.
Maybe
I don't
it
think
should, but will it?
Well, it just depends on people like you and people like all of us. Do we keep asking?
We have a crisis every week, maybe certainly every 2 weeks, and most of us can't remember the crisis of the week before last.
But that is actually the point, Vincent. I mean, I suppose all the anoraks and everybody else who's really involved in these things and close to them, they sort of lose and they move on to the next thing because there's always something more exciting. But the big issue is that this country, over the last number of years, like all of the things that have happened, they're all down to cronyism, corruption, all of that sort of stuff. And clearly, it's just still there. There's no difference. We haven't dealt with anything. We've just spoken about it. We've written about it. Occasionally, we chat about it on programmes like this. But Enda Kenny's attitude to the Moriarty Tribunal actually just sums it all up. Nothing has really happened. We had they tried to sort of dismiss the Dennis O'Brien situation. There was a kind of we just met on the balcony. We have no control who we're photographed with. I think that most people out there realise that that's just silly. It's just a load of rubbish. It makes no sense at all. It makes no sense to me, certainly.
How do you think of that?
I completely agree with Glenna. I'm amazed at the lack of inaction on Moriarty. I should declare my interest. I was one of the competing bidders in the second mobile licence where those unfavourable findings were made in Moriarty.
Did you pay money to anyone in respect to the licence?
No, I didn't. No.
Why?
Well, because apparently you shouldn't do that sort of thing, and I'm a strong believer in that. And but I tell you what I did.
There were a lot of rumours. I remember a lot of rumours. Dan, I don't know if you were in this country at the time, but there were a lot of rumours back in 1996 that a lot of money was paid to another politician. Not Michael Lowry.
I remember that. I remember that.
This was 1994.
Nothing to do with me or my consortium, I might strongly add. But there were a lot of rumours, and there have been a lot of rumours since then. I was a very young man with considerably more hair back at the time that we invested a huge amount of money with the consortium that we had, put in a massive effort, and to have these findings come out with the findings that said that a minister who, of course, and there was joint cabinet responsibility, secured the winning of something for somebody, is rather galling. To see nothing being done about it for a whole year, I think Glenna is exactly right. And that Bloomberg editorial that came out last week referenced the tribunals and their findings and the inaction as another reason why we should be looking at the broader context.
All right, we'll continue the discussion on what's in tomorrow morning's newspapers after the break. Join us then. Let's go back to the front page of the Irish Times, and down at the bottom of the front page of the Irish Times is the story Noonan met Lowry last year after adverse Moriarty report, and I think we can show you a close-up of that. There it is. And it says, Minister for Finance Michael Noonan has confirmed he agreed to meet independent TD Michael Lowry some months after he was censured by the Dáil following damning findings by the Moriarty Tribunal. Mr Noonan said last night that Mr Lowry led a delegation of youth organisation Feroga to the Minister's Dáil office last October and also took part in the meeting. The meeting between Feroga and the Minister was arranged through Deputy Lowry's office, and Deputy Lowry was present at the meeting. I'm not sure that there's anything improper about that, Lana and Declan. Dan, do you think there's anything?
It very much depends on what was discussed and what was, if anything, was given. I don't think there's necessarily, Lowry, whatever the Moriarty Tribunal found about him, he is an elected representative. That the Moriarty findings don't negate the fact that he has been re-elected. I think how many times since? A whole number of times since he was a minister. So if he talks to people, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a question of what's being discussed and whether ministers are whether there's influence peddling going on.
Yeah. Declan?
I agree with that. I mean, as I say, I have an axe to grind here with regard to the second mobile licence. But he is an elected representative. He has an obligation, not just a right, to represent his constituents. Whether or not he should be in the Dáil or whether he should have resigned after the findings is another matter. The fact that ministers are going to meet with him, given the nature of our political system, is understandable. To Dan's point, it depends what they did or what it was about.
Do you go along with that?
I think probably access to a government minister is the issue, and access is always the difficult thing. So if you compare Michael Lowry now with a backbencher in another party or an independent, if his access is greater, far greater, and has continued to be as it was, if it was business as usual in terms of access, because access to a minister is what delivers result apparently in Ireland. So that's why it's problematic and why it's unusual and why it's remarkable, and I think it's fair to remark on it. Michael
Lowry, some of the current cabinet, the Taoiseach, were members of that cabinet that made that award.
Including Michael Noonan.
Exactly.
Enda Kenny.
Yeah. And so that cabinet had joint responsibility for the decision made by that minister, and that decision was opined upon by the Moriarty Tribunal. There is some joint responsibility there. It's not being dealt with. But while Michael Lowry is in the Dáil, he's obviously going to meet with ministers. He shouldn't be doing it on terms different to any other member of the Dáil, of course.
Dan, talk us through your story on Irish households suffer most severe wealth cuts in Europe, and that's again on the front page of the Irish Times.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating thing that over the years we actually know very little about how wealthy people are, and that only recently have economists and statisticians started trying to measure how wealthy we are. We hear GDP, but that's like your salary or income. It doesn't tell us how wealthy countries are. And finally, different countries have got together, including our own central bank, a hugely interesting report that a bunch of their people, the central bank people, did yesterday. It shows that Ireland has suffered the biggest decline in wealth. A quarter of households' wealth has evaporated between 2007 and 2010, and it's even more than that because more wealth has disappeared last year, and that puts us now, in terms of households in this country, when you take all their assets and their debts, we're right in the middle. So the Dutch, the Dutch are a little richer and the Danes are a little poorer, but we're right in the middle.
The headline says study shows fall from 3rd to 7th richest in 3.
That's it. We're right in the middle. So out of 14 countries, there are 14 countries that have produced these data, these numbers.
Yeah. So we're still a hugely rich country.
Well, we're right in the middle of in the European...
which is the richest part of the world.
Yep.
So we're a very rich country. The problem is it's not really well distributed, the riches.
Well, this says nothing about distribution.
I know
that's
it doesn't.
a pet subject of yours, but there's nothing about distribution in this. This just gives us... Finally, we now know
pet
how much
subject
Irish
of mine. That's
about income distribution.
You don't think it's important?
I think it's very important, but I think personally I try and avoid a hobby horse. Speaking for myself.
And the hobby horse...
Speaking purely for myself.
Equality is a hobby horse. Somebody says we have had European control already. We want our identity back. Somebody else says we'll vote no because the playing pitch is not level and there's no respect or justice for the working class and the poor. Somebody else says the fiscal treaty is no good for Ireland. How can handing over power to Germany and Europe be good for our country? Somebody else says risk takers were the banks, not the people, no more austerity. Somebody else says we will need a referendum to pass. Did we need a referendum to pass the ESM treaty? Maybe we do. That's it for tonight. For more on tonight's programme, log on to tv3.ie. The weather's next. I'll be responding shortly to the texts and tweets from us tonight. Good night.
Two previous sets of new rules, so it's more rules, and I think yes, there is a need in Europe. The Greek situation was a fiscal crisis, the Italian situation a fiscal crisis, the Portuguese situation a fiscal crisis. None of those countries had banking crises. They were all fiscal crises, and they didn't manage their public finances well, and that was very clear. And now we need stronger rules, more effectively implemented, to make sure countries don't stay in high debt situations for a long time.
Just to press that issue a little further, that if we had those rules in operation prior to our fiscal crisis, it wouldn't have caused us to avoid the fiscal crisis.
That's debatable. The structural this idea of a structural deficit, which looks more deeply, it doesn't just look at revenues and expenditure, it looks more deeply at the nature of revenues. And are those revenues sustainable? Or in our case, as we know, they were a huge chunk of government revenues were being generated by a building boom. Now, even if that boom had just plateaued and we didn't have the crash, we would have had a big slowdown in government revenues. And there was a huge failure in the economics community as well as the policymaking community to flag that risk. Now, if we had that structural balance measure, we would have been looking more closely at that, and there is a possibility that it, at the very least, would have lessened the crisis that we have in this country.
The idea of the structural deficit seems, the definition of structural deficit seems to be fairly arbitrary, and that you could tweak it around to mean one thing in one situation, another thing in another situation, so it's not there. But finally, can I ask you, why would it be so awful for Europe if we were to vote against? Because it's going to go ahead anyway. Unlike we can't, like with European treaties, if we vote against, that's it, it can't happen. But in this instance, it's not a European treaty, not a EU treaty. If we vote against, it happens anyway.
So what would that mean? It would mean that on the basis that the 16 other members of the Eurozone ratify it, that you have a Eurozone bound by rules, but there's one exception. Ireland isn't bound by those rules. Now, I think that would not be a good thing. Rules, everybody has to abide by the same rules.
But the rules exist anyway.
But not these new specific. There are two specific new rules, two metrics, and I think it's very important to look back last year. A much bigger set of rules were agreed last year that most people didn't notice, but they included dozens of new metrics. The problem with the crisis that we have.
No, John Giles, I found him a lovely man with a gentle sense of humour. All right, let's get into tonight's programme. And Dan, what do you think are the persuasive reasons for voting yes to the fiscal treaty in the referendum?
The most important one is because of the gravity of the whole crisis. The reason that we have this treaty is because the euro, the edifice, the euro edifice simply has not functioned, and it is at risk of collapsing. And that would be a disastrous, truly disastrous thing for this country, for Europe, and indeed the rest of the world. And this is one part, and only a small part, of rebuilding the edifice and making it stronger so that it does survive. So that, head and shoulders, is the most important reason to support this thing.
Just to tease out that a little bit, even if our vote against the fiscal treaty were to cause the fiscal treaty itself to be cancelled, how would that lead to a collapse of the Eurozone, or the collapse of the euro?
As I say, this is one part of a broader strategy to try and redesign the whole thing. Not nearly enough has been done. This crisis has dragged on for 2 years. Leaders, and I think it's become almost a cliche, that European leaders did too little too late all throughout the crisis. They have acted with this. If even this small measure can't be agreed and implemented, then I think it will send a further signal that really Europe doesn't have the political will or the political capability to redesign its failed institution, and that itself will send a very powerful signal and there's huge uncertainty about everything now, but it could become self-fulfilling and make the crisis worse.
A lot of people say that the fiscal treaty is quite unnecessary and does very little. It changes very little. Now, it does change the requirement to reduce the budget deficit to 0.5% rather than 3%, but otherwise it changes very little. All the disciplines that that's in the fiscal treaty are already present.
They add all to all.
Tonight, the first of 5 debates we're planning on the fiscal treaty, on which there will be a referendum on the 31st of May. Joining us tonight are Dan OBrien, economics editor of the Irish Times, who's largely in favour of the fiscal treaty, and Declan Ganley, the well-known businessman, who's largely opposed to the fiscal treaty. Later we'll be joined by businesswoman Lana Lynch for our preview of tomorrow morning's newspapers. If you'd like to comment on the programme, you can text us to 53131 and place the word tonight before a comment, or send us a tweet at #FinB or email us at tonight@tv3.ie. I've done a blog on tonight's programme on the website politico.ie, and I hope to respond after the programme again on the website politico.ie to some of the issues raised in the texts and tweets. Before we get into tonight's programme, I want to say how sad the death this morning of Barney McKenna has been, one of the founder members of the Dubliners, as you've heard in the news. The departure of the last of the founder members is an end of an era for people of my generation who grew up with the Dubliners, and I was fortunate to know some of them. I also want to express my sadness at the death of Louis Kilcoyne, a former president of the FAI and member of the Irish Olympic Council. I got to know Louis through his brother